Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to St Bride's for this, in our lecture series, the Theology and Modernity lecture series, soon I think to be renamed the St Bride's Public Theology Lectures. It's going to make all the difference, obviously. It's a great pleasure to welcome Ellen here. I'll introduce her properly in a minute. Just a couple of notices, of course. Fire exit here, or at the back of church. Loos at the back of church, straight through where the blue signs are. At the back there. There's flyers on your seats, tell you a little bit about St Bride's Church, and our next lecture, which is a book launch by Paul Gordon-Chandler, who's coming over from America to do a bit of a book tour here with his book on Khalil Gibran, which comes very highly recommended, including by people like Michael Curry, previous Archbishop of Tech, and all sorts of other people whose opinion I respect, so it'd be great if you could share the word on
And
that.
he is a fantastic bloke as well.
And you met him.
He is really, really good.
So he's coming along, so do take
In my recent trip to New York.
There's a bunch of other flyers on the piano, so when you're having a cup of tea afterwards, you might want to help yourself take any of those. On the breakfast bar thing at the back where the tea and coffee was, there's an opportunity to sign up for our mailing list if you'd like to be kept up to date with all our events and things that are going on here. There's a roughly monthly mailing that comes out from the church, so you're not signing up for too much. If you put yourself down for that, or if you'd like to know about it, then do put on there. There's also a basket, the obligatory church donations notice. If you'd like to make a contribution, if you're in a position to make a contribution to the running of this church and the expenses of this lecture series, that would be very gratefully received. And if you're a UK taxpayer, there are gift aid forms that you can fill in and put in the basket too. What?
Oh yeah.
You come on in. So, it's a very great pleasure to welcome Reverend Canon Dr. Ellen Loudon, who's Canon Chancellor at Liverpool Cathedral and Director of Social Responsibility for the Diocese. Ellen's PhD is in Music Hall, and she also has just started running her own online radio show, The Pop Kitchen. So I'm sure she'll give you the URL for that if you would like to know more about that. But tonight she's going to speak to us with her Canon for Social Responsibility hat on and talk to us about how we can measure the idea of a bigger difference. Ellen.
Great, thank you. Now, it's very kind of you. Clap. But now I forgot to pick up the two apologies before I start, and there will be no further apologies. I forgot to pick up the clicker, so I have to be here. So that means that at certain points, you know, it's not going to be massively interesting. It's going to be some words, but. The second is that this is a work, so this isn't an apology, this is just a caveat from which you can explore what's going to happen. This is a work in progress, and this is the first time I've tried to speak about this in this way, but there's lots of little bits that maybe you've heard in different places that I'm trying to pull together and just try and talk about this in a way that might be of interest to us, because I think this is starting to resonate and starting to emerge as something that I really want to try and press through. So we'll see how we go. So this is what I want to talk about, and no, that's a bit weird, Warren. What's happened here? We were on a roll, weren't we? We were so optimistic about this, and now it just is doing nothing. Seriously, it's completely stopped. Okay, so good start. I was really made. I don't know if you remember seeing the poster for this particular lecture. You see that my first picture actually was just these little green tags. One of the things that when I've started to have a think about how to talk and measure and make sense of bigger difference, it all started for me was when does anybody shop in Waitrose? Yes. or any of those supermarkets where they give you a little token because you've spent lots of money with them, and they think, oh, we can give you this, and you can walk out and you can choose to put it in the dog's home, the very poor children, or the scouts, one of those things. Is it still really frozen? Do we need to just turn it off and turn it on again, like they do in the IT crowd? Oh! Brilliant. Nope, still. We'll have to threaten it again. No, it really wants to be a thingy, doesn't it? Yeah. So, yeah, no, it's doing everything it needs to do, but not when I want it to. So let's do it. Let's make it go away, and we'll bring it back again. So, I was really taken by this way of kind of measuring a charities or a kind of goodness, a bigger difference. I was really taken by this way that it's such a crass way to do it, but nevertheless, it's really fascinated me because somehow we're making a judgment, aren't we, with that as to where our money, our little green tokens, where our money goes to. So I started to think about, and this is not, don't get me wrong, this is not new stuff. People are trying to find ways to measure this, and Naomi is one of those people who's kind of tried to crunch data in the past. But how we, as in our diocese, in our particular way of thinking and looking at this, how we might be able to do this. Oh, do you know, is that? That's really fascinating. Okay, well, we've got a particular interest, haven't we? I just hate these funny.
Keep talking, I'll have a go.
I think I'm there.
Oh.
Right, okay. We've got a big challenge in our diocese. So Bishop Paul, I'll give you this in a little while, but Bishop Paul has talked about a bigger church to make a bigger difference. So the challenge for us immediately is we can count the bigger church. How do we count the bigger difference? More people knowing Jesus, more justice in the world. Again, we can say maybe, I think measuring faith is problematic in itself, but then measuring the impact that our actions that emerge from our faith, I think is even more problematic. So what I'm going to try and share with you today is some work in progress around this particular issue. Obviously, I've just started to outline what I think is the problem. How on earth do we start to measure what is the bigger difference? What I think is the impact of my actions might not be the same as the impact that, say, Warren thinks that I'm having. I might think I'm great, maybe I'm not, etc., etc. And we actually, as Christians, and I think as Christians who perceive ourselves, we are generally quite humble people. We would be quite tentative about being able to measure the impact that we have. So I want to kind of outline a little bit about what the problem is and how we might move through this. I want to lay a foundation. So one of the things I want to talk about is the foundation. So my theology of social justice, and as the director of social justice, it's slightly different from social responsibility. It's okay. No. So responsibility. I think we changed the word to justice because we're trying to use that, God's justice, the notion of God's justice, and how that's measured and how that is interpreted. So thinking about a theology of social justice, and I'll just lay the foundation of why on earth I'm doing what I'm doing. Thinking about the mission. So the mission in its broadest sense, and how then that is talked about in terms of social justice. What does bigger difference look like in terms of the way that we talk about the mission of the church? I want to look at a biblical story, a precedent for counting, and that story is no surprise to many people because it's the only story I've decided to tell for a year. So we'll see how that one pans out. And then a reflection on growth. So what are we counting for? What's the purpose of our counting? And if we're counting, what is that an indicator of? Us getting more just or becoming numerically bigger? Okay, so don't expect any solutions, by the way. That's a few years off. We'll see how we get on. Okay, so the problem the biggest problem I have is that I really want to see the death of neoliberalism. So I really do not want to count social justice in the way that we count financial things and bums on seats. I just don't think that that's going to work for this particular problem. However, and really interestingly, I was at the launch of this paper that the Heseltine Institute produced last week, which is around the scale, scope and value of the Liverpool City Region social economy. And it's a really good paper, don't get me wrong. But the key issue, I think, with this is that it doesn't measure the social impact of the social economy. It measures the financial impact of the social economy. And I think that whilst I'm perfectly happy to invest some of my time in trying to measure the financial, economic and growth in those terms impact of the bigger difference. I don't think that's going to be enough to drive through a potential solution amongst all of God's people. I just don't think that will interest us for very long. So I perceive that to be my biggest issue, is how I measure bigger difference that is slightly different but nevertheless can talk to that problem but isn't, so it's a different problem basically. Much of the work that we do is a response to human needs. So there's an expectation that will either continue indefinitely, so when Jesus says the poor will always be amongst us, or it will be resolved. So either we have to agree that there will always be food banks and therefore we just feed that need, or our social action, our social responsibility, our social justice leads us to drive towards the end of food banks. So hello. So it's measuring, it's what we actually want to measure. So do we want to measure the number of people that come to a food bank, or do we want to measure the number of food banks we close? So I think that's, and it doesn't really matter to me what one we do. I just want to be really clear what our objectives are. Yeah, so that's a problem. I haven't got a solution to that one either. Here we go. The language of social justice or social change is like jelly, and it never sets and it wobbles all over the place. It literally, we will talk about social justice. Just already, we've talked about the thing that I do in two different ways. Is it responsibility? Is it justice? Is it about mercy? Is it about the humility of the God's people to change the world for the better? Everybody talks about it in a different way. So therefore, unlike something you can measure physically, so I can tell you how many people are sat in this room, and I can probably tell you eventually what your financial impact is on the church if you tell me how much you give, etc., how much you earn. I can find, but I can't. It's really difficult for me to have a complete, transparent conversation with each of you about what you perceive is your impact in terms of justice in the world. So it's, again, I'm sorry, I don't really come in with lots of problems, no solutions here. When I say we're not attempted this in any extensive way before, and there are no benchmarks or precedent, I'm really talking about us in our diocese. There's been lots and lots of research on this, hasn't there, Naomi? Loads and loads of research, but there's still yet to be a benchmark against which we can measure. So it doesn't, again, if we know if we just create, people, if you did O-level chemistry, you'll know like having a control. There's no control there for us to say, well, we're going beyond this. That's universally kind of, I'll tell you about potential for a benchmark that maybe as a church we will have, or the Church of England, that we may have put in place, but in a little while. But certainly in our diocese, there has been no consistent attempt to measure the social impact of anything that we do. We have a lot of data on how many people come to church and how much money they generate, but not very much on this. So there you go, those are all our problems. So why do it? I think that, and hopefully in a minute I'll explain theologically why I think this, is that this is our story, this is our good news, this is our gospel, this is the reason why Jesus did the things he did, is to change the world for the better. And I just don't understand why we tell the story of growth in any other way. It just doesn't compute with me. And I think if we just turn that round and talk about the good news, like Jesus, obviously, the gospel writers did, it was all impact. It was story after story of the way that Jesus changed the world for the better. So I do think we have to tell the story of the impact that we have. I think that one of the reasons that those stories are told in the Gospels in the way that they are is because they were an encouragement to the early church to see through the difficulties that they were going through. And I think if we don't tell these stories, we will stop encouraging each other. And I feel like I've got myself into having come from an evangelical background, measuring how many people said the Jesus prayer, I'm still would love, I love those conversations where you think, well, I'll help somebody to move further into their faith and have a deeper understanding of, but actually to be able to help somebody to understand the significance and the impact that they're having on changing the world for the better. That's to me the kind of stories that, at the moment, I have no idea what we do well. And it's partly because I'm feeling like this, again, the food bank is a really good example. I'm feeling like we do that really, really well, but we do something that's really bad really well. And it makes me sad to think that we feed 300 people. So it feels like we do something really, really well each week. So I'm happy to let this happen, and I want then some other people to fight for it to shut. Doing the two things at once. So I don't know what we do well, and there's no benchmark, there's no measure. So I want to know how we can do what we do better. So, again, measuring, however we measure it, we just got to get going with it. I want to know what we can do better. And again, I think if we don't have a way of measuring or making sense of it or having a narrative that we can speak into and speak to each other with, we won't know what we can do better. I think because we've got used to talking about our faith, missionally talk about our faith in one particular way, around proclamation. I'll talk about the 5 marks of mission in a minute. Because we've got used to speaking about it in proclamation terms, we've stopped being able to identify the language of social justice. And to me, it flows right the way through the whole Bible. And it's the reason why we need to make sure we speak and read the Old Testament every week, because that's the story of the people of God. And I think that we need to find, if we don't start to count and we don't start to measure and don't start to talk and don't start to do, we're losing that incredible rich inheritance of social justice language at all levels. And I think identification about how we want to talk about this has to get better than just being nice and be do-gooders. Not that we do that, but you know what I mean. It's got to be. If we're going, so then again, there's a bit of a problem here. If we're going to get bigger, we're going to have more time. We're going to have more resources. That's one scenario. If the church is going to get smaller in the next decade or 50 years, it's a different problem, but it still needs to be considered. How we use our diminishing resources to still have the biggest impact. And if we don't know, at least have some sort of idea about what the previous questions are around, we won't be able to use those resources wisely. I think that we've just got so used to just running around seeing a problem, it's like watching sort of teenage boys playing football. It's like there's the ball, or everyone run after the ball until they get a manager that can. Do you know what I mean? It's just like managing these resources effectively, and so I think if we have a better understanding of that, we may well use our time and our resources more effectively. So I'll just talk to you a little bit about the grounding of this, and then so that, I think, is the story. That's the point, that life and life in its fullness. So we obviously have that promise about the boundless generosity of God and the call of the people of God to replicate this. That's the call. That's the basis of our of God's vision of a restored kingdom is one of justice and mercy, and that we're expected to participate in that kingdom, but a kingdom plan by ensuring that no one is excluded and everyone is welcome. So that's the promise. That's where we're up to. We know what the hard news is that that seems really far off, that we seem so unattainable, that we're just caught up in this never-ending cycle of not being able to get there. And that's we're there, but not quite. So it's how this story of the good news, the promise, is going to be told to the world. So how do we get that story out there? And I don't know the solution, but we know that the story's ending is that the coming kingdom is the thing that we should be striving for. So participating in that kingdom is kind of the point of our endeavours, our bigger difference, our more justice in the world. So I'm just going to run through where I think why on earth I'm doing this, really. So my theology of social justice is predicated on the understanding, it's a number of, so this one, that God is radically generous and that we are called to replicate this. This seems like really straightforward. The generosity of God is our responsibility to replicate. God longs for justice and mercy to be seen in the earth and for all people, and calls on the church to enact that. So there's the replication, then there's the enacting. It just, is our job, basically. That Jesus' ministry inspires us to learn to do good, to seek justice, correct oppression, and bring justice. And that's the basis, I think, of that inspiration, that kind of needing to press on through it. That Jesus' death and resurrection confronted the world order of desolation, isolation from God, and initiated the coming kingdom of liberation and new life. If I didn't believe that, I can't see the point of just doing this stuff. It's about liberation, it's about new life, and it's about being part of a story, joining in it, and moving forward through it. I also don't think that is possible unless I'm equipped by the Holy Spirit. You see how brilliantly Trinitarian I am there? And that the Holy Spirit will equip us to join in that kingdom story, to follow Jesus' example and live courageous, liberated and just lives to the glory of God. I know I can't do that on my own. I'm just too rubbish. And I think that I genuinely think that we as a church we miss a trick when we try and think that we can do this stuff by ourselves. It's just not what we're supposed to do. We're different. The story is that we're equipped by the Holy Spirit to walk and follow and be courageous and liberate. I'm just not courageous without the Holy Spirit. So 5 marks of mission. Is everyone? So the 5 marks of mission, these inspire me because they are the only thing that the Anglican Church can agree on. So, oh, that's my paper's gone. So this is where we quite often get stuck, on the proclamation of the good news of the kingdom. So that's it now. We can all just that's what mission is all about, isn't it? But actually, there are 5 more marks. Teach, baptise, nurture new believers. Respond to human need by loving service. Transform unjust structures of society to challenge violence of every kind and pursue peace and reconciliation. Who knew that this was mission? And the 5th one. Who knew? Everybody, the whole Anglican Church had agreed on these 5 marks. To strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. That's our mission. That's what we agree mission is. But we get stuck with one and completely forget. So if the good news of the kingdom is justice, mercy, reconciliation, etc., etc., if that is the good news, then we should be teaching, baptising and nurturing new believers into that good news. It just seems, what else is the good news? And then the good news will then is that we respond to human needs by loving service, that we transform unjust. Who knew that that was the point of the Church of England? The whole Anglican communion was to transform unjust structures, challenging violence of every kind, and pursue peace and reconciliation. I mean, this is just great. This is a good mission to be part of, isn't it? Why don't we know this? It's bizarre. And safeguarding the integrity of the earth always comes fifth, doesn't it? Yes?
Teach, baptise and nurture new believers. What about each other? Because actually sustaining all that is really, really hard.
I didn't write the 5 marks of mission, lad. I think there's an assumption that this is the mission of the church to the world. So that actually the church has a responsibility to each other to sustain and maintain discipleship for each other. But actually this is our mission to the world. The fact that well, I don't know, do we do it? I don't know, we don't know if we do really.
We're not, because we're in competition with each other, we're in a world where there's a competition, we put each other down to make ourselves feel good,
Yeah.
we're striving against each other in
Yeah.
churches. So I think we
Yes.
Number 4.
Yes.
The thing to transform and destruction of society. That for me says you have to be political.
Yeah.
You have to be. And yet everyone's saying, oh, don't get involved.
Yeah.
Mistake.
Yeah. Well, it depends whether it's party political, whether I mean those unjust structures can happen at every level, at any level. Some of us will be definitely called into the challenging of unjust structures in the kind of political sense, but some of us might be literally sitting on a PCC because somebody is very annoying and rude, and that actually the point is that you're trying to push the unjust structures that a small group of people have held on to power. Do you know, I have absolutely no idea, I'm not making that up, but there's all kinds of unjust structures that we live in. I've got a brilliant badge now, haven't I? I've got this badge that basically, I'm wearing this because I've decided that that's the end of it. I'm not going to pretend anymore. It's just, smash the patriarchy! Because I just don't think the patriarchy is very good for anybody. I don't think it's good for boys, I don't think it's good for girls, for children, anyway. So whatever badge you want to wear for now. So anyway, shall I tell you a story of... So can anybody read that? Does anybody want to read out loud for me? Miranda, could you read out loud for me?
After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him, because they saw the signs that he was doing to the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming towards him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to all those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world."
So, Jesus' attempts to withdraw from the people fail, and they draw him in to the signs, the actions of justice and mercy in healing and deliverance. Jesus joins his disciples where they were, and they're up a mountain, and the people come to him. This seems to be the story all the time, is this action of justice and mercy draws the people to Jesus and draws the people to his disciples. You'll notice very early on in our story, the need is identified. How are we going to feed them? Good question. This is, we mentioned before, this is one we encounter every week, don't you, in the food bank. Jesus expects Philip to come up with a plan. How often do we say, oh, Jesus, God, why is there so much starving people in the world? Why is this? Philip is challenged to come up with a plan straight away. Philip identifies a really big problem, massive problem, and exaggeration, hyperbole, I have absolutely no idea, but it's clearly a massive problem for them. Too many people, not enough money. Andrew then outlines the resources that are available: 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. I don't know in this particular section, you could take this as being Philip and Andrew being really sarcastic and rude to Jesus, saying, or it's just literally a statement of facts, but it always seems to me a little bit like, oh, how are we going to feed them anyway? And who has access to the resources? The boy. The boys, they've identified the resources available and who has access to those resources. There's a very interesting geographical note that there was a great deal of grass in the place. I've said this before, I can't see why you would put that in there unless that was significant, given the rest of the detail. There must be something about the geography. There we go. But again, if you think about the problems that we are encountering, that we see, we identify there's a problem, we see who might have the resources, we see what is physically available. There is an interesting note about resting and waiting. I love this bit, and this is where that Holy Spirit thing comes in again. Before anything happens, Jesus says, sit down, rest, and wait. So you identify the problem, who's got the resources, sit down, rest and wait. And they sit down. Then there's the interesting note about counting. So I'm encouraged to a certain extent that there is counting. So there's 5,000 in all. And as I said, if that's men, then there's usually a lot more women in church, so therefore there's going to be quite a lot more women than men perhaps, and children. We know there's at least one, because he's got all the resources. Jesus gives thanks, and again that's emerging from that rest, and emerging from that pause, and then it's distributed to those who are seated. There's as much as they wanted. It's an interesting word around satisfaction. It's a great word, isn't it? Satisfied feels like it's a good satisfactory word. Nothing was lost. Nothing was wasted. All the fragments are gathered in. And even after all that, everyone got what they wanted. They were satisfied. We're told there is huge amounts left over. So that kind of disparity, this sudden moment where, there wasn't enough. At the end of the story, there's huge amounts left over. The people who saw this miracle were under no illusion that this was a sign from God, and sign that God had come into the world, that the story of God, the physical presence of God in Jesus was in the world. And we're told, and this is why our social justice is really important, we're told they believed and they followed. Now they didn't believe and follow because Jesus had stood up and enacted the first mark of mission. Jesus was destroying and breaking down unjust structures by this. It's not possible in the structure and hierarchy of the Jewish nation in that particular time. It's not possible for this to happen on that structure. Every mark of mission is being enacted and lived out in this. It's not just proclamation. So, I'm going to have to whiz now. The story is important because I think it measures and evaluates social, spiritual and physical change. It's actually a story about all of those things. It's about signs and wonders in our community. It's about the extraordinary everyday happening that happens here, that we don't have enough food, we distribute the food, we move on. It's an everyday miracle that we are engaged in. And this is what this is. It's a sign and wonder in our communities. Our work, our social justice work, is evidence. It's the living out, it's the being, the active role in continuing of Jesus' work. We are doing, every time we enact and live out social justice, we're doing what Jesus did. And in it, we're creating space for the Holy Spirit to transform what we have. If we don't create that space, the bread and the fish aren't transformed by Jesus into something miraculous. The tins of fish, the pasta, whatever, then it's not turned into something miraculous. We don't create that space, then we're missing out on so much of what our story is all about and who we are. If we get caught up in this, and why this story is so extraordinary, is because it's a story of generosity. It's a story of the action of one small boy. I mean, this story is in every gospel, so it's told differently every time. But in this particular one, there's one small boy with his little meagre rations. It's not possible for that to do the thing it does without the initial act of generosity. So that's the reason why this story. And there's doubt at the heart of this story. Right at the beginning, there's doubt all the way there. But actually, this story replaces any doubt with flourishing. At the end of the story, people are flourishing. It's just an extraordinary story of flourishing. And just want to give you that back to see how that story fades back into that where I started from in terms of my theology, the way that I think about God, the way that I think about my motivation for this. So I'm going to quickly whiz through something for you. I'll leave you with this, and I'll just ask these questions, and we haven't got enough time to reflect out loud, but we maybe in our questions we can. So, what's the presenting need that you've noticed? And this will be different for everyone, or it might be a shared need. In that story, Andrew and Philip have that conversation with Jesus, and they recognise there is need. There's not enough food, we haven't got enough money, what are we going to do? What can you offer? So do you have a couple of loaves and some fishes? What is it that you have to offer? Small, insignificant, offering that up. Are you willing to offer it up to be blessed? Are you ready to take action? And are you ready, and this is really significant in terms of what I'm going to talk about in a minute, about in terms of the impact. If you do offer it up, if you are willing, you have to deal with the consequences, and the consequences in my theology, in this way that this story is told, is that it will take off and it will expand way beyond any of your own sort of our own limitations. So are we ready for that? So I'll give you this. This is I don't know. Is this one of my crazy ideas? Where was it? Oh, here it is. Do you want to? I'm sorry, some of them are colour and some of them are black and white. It's not personal if you get a black and white one, it's just that the printer went funny. So I was trying to because I'm trying to find ways to measure social justice that are they're a bit like those little green things you put in the pot, but they're not like money. And it's about a transaction in some way, but it's not like a financial transaction. So I don't know how to talk about it. So I just started talking about it and seeing if I could measure it in a slightly different way. So I thought that if we had impact plus flourishing and a buzz, we'd see growth. That seemed to be the story of the feeding of the 5,000. There was impact, we saw flourishing, created a buzz, and then we're told it grew. So there we go. Impact being what we can measure. Flourish is the story of the difference making. Buzz is the culture that we create as a result of our difference making. And growth is what happens because we expect Jesus to transform the little we have into the miraculous generosity that we need. Seems really simple, doesn't it, suddenly? Oh, maybe it wasn't such a silly idea. So impact is what we do to make a difference. And you know what you do. It's no good me telling you what you do to make a difference, and everybody will do something different. And some of you will do it collectively, but it's what we do. The ordinary, amazing things that we do to change the world for the better. The random acts of individual acts of justice and mercy, and the way that we speak and witness to the glory of God. It's just the way that we are, who we are. What is flourishing? I think we don't flourish on our own. That seems like a bit of a pointless thing. The whole point of the feeding of the 5,000 is 5,000 people flourish together. They got a lot of stuff from very little. And it was driven by a small leadership team, but nevertheless it was about flourishing together. So it's being on purpose, playing a part in the change and witnessing difference. Witnessing, I think, is really important. The reason why those people were so transformed, because they played a part in it, but they also were witness to it. It's also around that collaborating in amazing difference-making acts in our community. I genuinely, as well, do not think that we can do this unless it's something that makes our hearts sing. It's awful to think that the food bank creates a buzz because it feeds, but whatever it is that makes your heart sing, whatever is deep, deep inside you that you know that you have to do, and pleasure isn't quite the right word, but it's just something that it's the story of your life. It's the thing you have to do. It's the song that you have to sing. I think the buzz that we create in this, and the buzz that happened in the story of the 5,000, is when massive kingdom connections together happen in the name of Jesus. Then one of the extraordinary things that happens in that story is that they understand that Jesus is God coming into the world. Massive, massive leap in terms of the way that the people were connecting with Jesus, and they made that together. There was this connect that was like penny drop together. I think it is about celebration, and it's about seeing God's work in our communities and celebrating it. And it's that taking that step, isn't it, of always saying, yes, I'm doing it, I'm making the impact, I can see I'm flourishing, my community is flourishing, but actually it's God's work that I've walked into. Sharing that indiscriminately and celebrating it with others, not holding on to it, not seeing it as our own, something that we contain, we hold, we can determine, and is walking into God's plan and then seeing justice and mercy flow. So I'm really sorry, I'm really going fast now. So I think growth is what happens when we, as in Jesus' disciples, make an impact, flourish together and create an irresistible buzz. That's what the feeding of the 5,000, that's the story, that's all it is to me. So you see what I've done here. So I pulled the 5 marks of mission and say, this is what I think. It's really difficult because I think the church will grow if we do this, and I think that then can be the measure. Do you see what I mean? It's just that if we do this, the church will grow, and then rather than the other way round. So if growth can be a measure for social change, and we start to measure it the other way round, and we start to use different language than bums on seats, then we will engage in mission in a holistic way. We will see the proclamation of good news articulated in terms of justice and mercy. We will baptise and nurture people into bigger difference. Collectively and individually will respond to human needs in a way that has significant impact. And we will ask that question. If we engage in need here, will it make an impact? What will the impact be? Will it change? We will see unjust structures crumbling. If we're engaging in the responding to human need in a way that challenges unjust structures, we will see those start to crumble away. And again, this holistic change in the way we care for the earth, it just seems like a really bizarre thing. We just don't do it. It seems like it's almost like. So when I went to this, when the launch of this report, there was a very significant investment organisation in the city there saying how brilliant it was that something around 30% of their investment portfolio was ethically invested. It was like, oh, does that mean that 70% of it isn't? It's like it's like the living wage. So like we should be really proud in this city that it's 8% or 10% of all employers pay the living wage. So we're happy enough that 90% of them don't, pay a wage that people can't live on. So it just seems like we've started looking at the world in a really peculiar way. There you go. So it seems to me really straightforward. The biblical precedent suggests that we will grow numerically when we gather a crowd, and we will see the kingdom come. I just don't understand why we do it any other way, really. So I ought to slow down, really. I hadn't timed this because I run out of time to time it. That's what happens. So we're moving in the next phase of what we're trying to do in the Diocesan Oversight team. Is we've heard what Bishop Paul says about church to make a bigger difference. We are, we're asking God to do that. More people knowing Jesus, more justice in the world. And trying to say, well, look, that's the story. That's where we're at. That is what we're trying to do. But how are we going to bring somebody new into that story? So the next challenge is that how do we bring somebody with us to join in it? So you probably noticed that the bulletin and various other things are kind of inviting somebody in to our story for Advent and leading into Christmas. And that being, if you let people that you disagree with tell the story, then you'll never get a chance to tell the story yourself. So finding a way to tell God's story in the way that means that you can bring somebody else into it, equipping God's people, that's Miranda's job, that's the reader's job, that's you as leaders, that's you as... equipping God's people to tell the story is really, really vital. And getting people to join on the adventure of God, as God set before us. I really want to be able to tell the good news. So I want to find a way to articulate it better. So I think this is the big conundrum, really. Is that this is kind of I'm laying out my stall here, but I still haven't solved the problems that I've flagged up at the beginning. And perhaps in the next sort of 5-10 minutes we can start to think about together and give me some ideas about where to take this work next, about how we want this difference to count. So how is this going to actually count? And how am I going to take this back to the bishop and say, look, this work happens because... So we'll come back and talk to that in a minute. But I did want to share this with you because I think this is quite... When I said at the beginning that we didn't have a benchmark that was universal, things have slightly changed in the last year, in that this year, for the first time, church wardens, when you're filling in your mission stats form, for the first time, incumbents, we have an opportunity to answer a question, number 14 on your mission stats form, that will give us at least some indication and a benchmark about what kind of work is happening in churches. Yes, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, plus another. And it will, for the first time, enable me to see what is actually happening. But it's only going to work if people fill in these forms. It's all online. We usually get about Naomi, what's the comeback usually? Do we know? We don't know from the diocese. Usually we get from our mission stats forms, we get sort of like some 70, 80%, which is really very good. But we don't know what the impact of this is, whether people will just say, oh, I can't be bothered. So this is going to be very important for me in terms of how to benchmark. I want to just share with you this, the outcomes of the Christians in Practice report. And again, how they've, can you actually see this? It's really little, isn't it? How they've identified activities, so bigger difference activities in that report, and the impact how that has made an impact. Again, statistical evidence, but nevertheless really useful in terms of how people are going to talk about the impact that social justice has. Again, on the pink page, is about how that those connections and activities go beyond the church and the effect that has. I'm only sharing this with you because I didn't want you to think that nobody else is doing this and nobody's ever thought about it. It is happening, but it's just how extensive it's going to be and how we then choose to talk about it and what that impact looks like. And then the last thing I wanted to share with you was the research. These are the headlines from that report that was released by the Heseltine Institute last week. And what it demonstrates is that across the voluntary faith community sector, we have a really big impact. Working together and being able to identify and isolate and look at our resources, there's an awful lot going on here. But as I say, so far we can measure the financial impact of it, but not the impact of the social change itself. So again, if anybody ponders this stuff and has any kind of miraculous sort of transformation of thinking, then it'd be really useful to hear it and have your feedback on it. So that's it. There we go. Wasn't too bad, was it?
No, thank you.
So, Warren, would you like, if there are any questions, me to stay here and answer questions? Yeah.
Yeah, do people have any questions further? One that sprung to mind, which I'm going to jump in with, was I loved your point about if we're doing mission well, we will see unjust structures crumbling.
Yeah.
It just occurs to me that might mean a smaller church, to the extent that the church structures we have are unjust. And that would be a good thing, but wouldn't necessarily, it would be like the food bank closing because we'd worked so we didn't need it anymore.
Yeah.
Some church structures probably need to crumble if they're not just. So it wouldn't necessarily link into them leading to a bigger church. I don't know if you want to.
No, I think it's entirely possible that I think the question is that if we know what the issue is, we know what the resources are, and we have some sort of benchmark. If the church gets smaller, it will be for the right reasons. I think the difficulty at the moment is that the chances are that the church will get smaller because people die, which is actually a really bad reason for it to get smaller. I think that it's entirely possible that the unjust structure is crumbling and people become disaffected with it for those reasons. Maybe, but then it also might mean a floodgate is opened on the other end. I just don't know, but it doesn't, worrying about what the effect of it is, that doesn't seem to be what the mission is. The mission is to do it. Yeah. So, but yeah, absolutely, an unintended consequence of the destruction of patriarchy might be that men just give up and go take to their beds. That seems to be an unlikely scenario, but you never know. Sorry.
I just wondered where the major aid agencies, overseas aid agencies, would fit into this, having been a member of Australia's staff for many years.
Yeah. I don't know the answer.
Yeah, that's all right. Yes.
Because So Christian Aid, I don't know how they manage their mission, and I don't know what, because but.
Well, they would have links, or do have links with different...
I don't know how that, I mean, it just depends how they make the decisions that they make. I guess I'm looking at us as a church, and specifically the Church of England, and even more specifically the Diocese of Liverpool. But I think how we identify mission, so say Christian Aid might say, right, so if we go back to the 5 marks of mission, interesting, when I've done some work around the 5 marks of mission with people, one of the things that happens is that sometimes people, so if I get people to, go back here, to say, what, in terms of their action, their social justice action, where they fit it into the 5 marks of mission. So first of all, when I've talked to PCCs, and I've really happily come and speak to you, a small group or a bigger church really, whether so talking about what's the theological or the biblical or the rationale, any rationale for the thing that you do. So just to start to talk about it. So some people have got it really clear, so it might be the wedding at Cana, might be just Mary, who knows, but everybody has different reasons why they engage in social justice. And some people say, well, I don't engage in social justice, I just do stuff. And you think, well, why do you do stuff? It's really just dig into that. And then once people have got a language and they've got a story, it's then saying, well, okay, well, where does your action fit? And some people who have a particular theology might say, well, my action fits into one. So my action is... Some people who have a particular theology might start to, or way of talking about social justice, may see their social justice mainly being in 3. So they see it as loving service. Some people might actually be engaging in social justice because, etc., etc. So once you start to think about where it all sits, when you hear that story in a group, you'll be surprised that most of those marks of mission are articulated in some way, and if they're not, then you start to identify where your gaps might be. So it's a really interesting piece of work, and I think that when you think about Christian Aid, they may look at that and they may say, actually, we are in loving service.
Can I just say, I'm talking to a friend who works at Christian Aid at Greenville, and I went to the USPG conference 2 years ago. In both those contexts, both USPG and Christian Aid were very explicitly saying, actually we want to make sure that we hit each one of these, and they were kind of auditing what they did in terms of are they doing each of the different sections. So it's something that they're quite aware of.
Oh yes, well,
and they get themselves, charities, this is the reason why, we mustn't get too focused on being a charity, because charities will feel sometimes stuck and unable to engage fully with 4 because they feel that the charity laws don't allow them to push. I would contend that the charity laws do allow them to push, but I can see why people would get stressed out about that. But I don't understand why you push until it gives, don't you?
You mentioned that some of this is about the political, not necessarily part of it.
Yeah.
How can you avoid the labelling as being the one side of the party political spectrum, and therefore being dismissed by those who perceive that?
I think it's about, I don't know, for me it's a bit like infiltration really. So I think if you can find a way to do that. So I don't know how useful in terms of the work that I'm doing with the city region, how useful that's going to be, but it seems like to me it seems like a possible way to act as an infiltrator into a structure that might give a little. As the world set out at the moment, I think it feels like there's an inevitability that will be party political, but I don't think it should be. I think we've seen some really good, just Conservative MPs in the past, and I don't see why we shouldn't see them again. It feels a bit fragile at the moment. We've also seen some very unjust Labour Party candidates who, quite frankly, you know, it's the structures that have not allowed women to rise up through the Labour Party, that have not encouraged younger people to take an active role. It's a party that doesn't really have a very strong policy on green politics, and all of those things that even in party political terms, we have a responsibility to kick back. It's certainly one of the reasons why I ended up joining the Women's Equality Party as well as the Labour Party, because I just felt that just was just not being attended to. Yeah, so be a spy, an infiltrator.
There's a way that we need to think that we're also involving party political issues outside that political box. I remember hearing somebody at Greenbelt a few years ago talk about big society. And I was getting so irritated as I was listening to it, thinking, no, not the big society, that's just feeding Cameron's agenda. And what we really need to do is push the states to support.
Yeah.
Which was okay at the time, but the world's changed.
And yet what we do is that we, you know, at St Bride's, we support a food bank that essentially is the perfect example of the big society. We are solving, by solving one injustice, we're creating or collaborating with a massive injustice.
Well, I'm a lawyer, and my big thing was the government have got rid of legal aid. So why should we do free legal work when the government should be paying for it?
Yeah.
But the problem is with the food bank is we don't do it in Wales. And if lawyers don't do work free, then people don't get represented in the benefits tribunals. And so it reaches that critical point when you've got to go beyond your political loyalties. If I don't do it, nobody will.
Nobody's going to do it. And you're absolutely right. And this is why I think it's really interesting conversation around 3 and 4. It's what, 60 years since the Beveridge report this year? And for me, the big question's been, you know, how do we as a church start to engage in that idea that we might become service providers again? Should we become service providers? And if we do, how do we do that? And do we really want to make competitive bids with organisations like Serco? Is that really what we want to do? Do we want to go back? Or do we decide to be smaller and just focus on the remit of... So I'm not sure that there's an answer. I think possibly we have to try all of them and see what happens, which gives. Yeah. I don't think we have a capacity in the church to be service providers on the level of Serco. I even think that we don't have, when we can barely keep food banks open. But that means maybe we had to be more irritating.
Then again, it's the skill set of the community coming together, and it does some of them
Yeah.
within this room now, being a skill set of knowledge and passion and vision to be able to serve more to business. The thing that they've got is the procurement skills and expertise and how to tick the boxes in the business stuff.
Absolutely, but then all of us would have to agree that would be our mission. So all of us would have to stop doing other things. So we'd have to stop engaging in, we'd have to say, well, okay, we're going to, and that's not how people...
But that's the service provider provides the services, so that would be the difference, wouldn't it? So the church would be facilitating the process for the service to be put in place.
You'd have to, it's just, the nightmare of procurement, I just don't know. It is an absolute nightmare, isn't it? And the amount of collateral you have to have, which is why Serco can do it, because they can say that they have X number of millions sat there. So if it all goes belly up, you know, we have.
Way though, and I think that's easy. And I think one of the things looking at this is the social capital, the volunteer capital, and the self-care and the wisdom that's given to the community. So we tend to look at things with an asset in terms of activity. But how many people come to the church and go away and don't end up in hospital themselves? Don't end up needing getting care or taking care of themselves and taking medication. And it's all them other aspects of social that needs to be measured alongside the activity plan.
I mean, it absolutely, completely has to, because I don't think the church can any longer see itself as being a goalkeeper that just stops balls getting in the back of the net. I think it has to go out there and play. And if it's going to go out there and play, it's what game is it playing? And I think that's the I just don't know how to play it at the moment, other than just go and give it a go. Because if we're constantly measuring what we don't do,
It's like the thing with evidence-based, isn't it? The NHS, for example, they're the commission if it's got a nice National Institute of Health and Social Care excellence evidence-based. And if you've got that, most of it's built around value for money,
yeah.
not outcome, you're always going to be competing. But I think that's where the strength of the church is. It's going for place-based approaches. So the place-based and the community developments and what you can bring to that area, I think that would be the strength.
So halfway up a mountain on a piece of grass. It's just where you happen to be, isn't it? Yeah.
Just coming back to number 4, transform and structures of society. Wasn't that what Jesus was actually about? I mean, dear friends here, some of them know I'm always asking this question. Why was Jesus crucified? Because he challenged his empire then.
Yeah.
And they couldn't cope with it. And is it not the same today? Am I right or wrong about that?
Well, I would have thought so, but it doesn't seem to, necessarily. Yeah, Miranda.
I was just wondering, I haven't done any work on this for a long time, but I remember when I was doing a book on chaplaincy, having long discussions with my fellow editor, the hospital chaplain. We were trying to discuss how we could talk about measuring the impact that chaplaincy was having in order to justify to sponsoring all institutions whether they could employ a chaplain. And we were looking at measures like, staff retention or student retention or mental health outcomes or that kind of thing. But we ended up having a really big discussion about whether actually they were the right things to measure or whether actually it was playing into unhelpful games to try and measure those things. Now, he went on to do a PhD on the impact that chaplaincy was having in neonatal units. And he was talking to me about narrative-based evidence, which was about analysing story rather than doing numerical things. And I just wondered if that was something you'd looked at or might look at in the future. It's not something I know a lot about, but it sounded like quite an interesting way of approaching it.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? And I think that's basically almost what I'm saying is that you have to look at it in a narrative way. But it's again how that narrative has impact. That's.
But partly that impact comes from people sharing together in analysing that narrative and not actually taking part in it, and then it being analysed somewhere else by someone else and writing a big report, which actually doesn't impact on those people.
Yeah.
I got the impression from what he was saying that there was some slightly more academic basis than just we're telling stories.
Yeah.
Something about doing word analysis on the stories and that.
And you can do it with people. We did that in Everton. We were
Right.
looking at saving NHS premises, and actually the people who trained in the local community, delivered the work, did questionnaires, came back, got all the narrative. We did the narrative together, and everyone who took part was part of it.
It's time consuming, which is why the investment is hard.
It is.
Yeah, go on.
I'm just thinking that in some ways, that I work in the arts and I work with a company called Collective Encounters who go out and do social justice in an artistic way with people, and we have evidence the health and well-being and the mental health in a report that Liverpool City Council commissioned. And I'm thinking that there is a parallel there, and you could, it would do no harm to look at how,
you're absolutely right.
That has been done within the arts. Because the Arts Council, the government, everyone is always saying you have to have evidence. You have to show that the impact you're having has got some solid facts. And we're doing that in the arts because that's how you get funding. You say, well, look at this statistic, look at this, and grab things from a report that's been done. So yes, it is a lot of work in it. It does take initial investment, but once you've got it there, you can then utilise it in order to get funding, to get those organisations on board, etc., etc.
Yeah.
This is actually a really serious question, although it may not sound like it. What is the significance of the grass?
The grass, the significance of the grass.
He isn't in there.
Well, it's in most of the stories, isn't it? Is it 3 out of 4 of the stories mention the fact that they're in the grass? I think it's the beginning of the flourishing. It seems to be. There's also something about the place for rest. What do you think?
It just sprung to my head that it's getting back to grassroots, and that in that sense, it's where and because I don't know much about the history of the church, but my brother-in-law, who is a Christian, he said there was a split very early on in the church. One went down that's ended up here, and there's the Jess. See, I'm not sure about the history, but the actual teachings of Jesus and what he did, there was a split, wasn't there?
Yeah. There are lots and lots of splits. We're in the middle of one at the moment.
And this lady here was saying, isn't that what Jesus did in number 4, to actually go up against unjust structure in society?
I wonder whether the grass is about the resources. Actually, the resources they've got are actually 5 loaves, 2 fish, and a lot of grass. But nobody even thought to mention the grass. They didn't say, oh, we haven't got lots of grass here, because they were talking about feeding people. It seemed totally irrelevant. But actually, Jesus notices, actually, you can sit down, because there is some grass. So actually, one thing we can do is sit you down and organise you into this space, because actually he's looking at the gift they've got of the particular place.
This is about something about place, isn't it?
About place and situation.
Yeah.
And there are gifts comfortable place near to water. It's a good place to be, and you can rest. And that's have a picnic.
Yeah. Is that what you were thinking? Is it?
No, but I was wondering it on a more mystical level. But thinking of it like that, about it being about the place, then maybe that's something that has to be considered about what is it that's unique about Liverpool, about this.
What about, and taking it down to its minutiae, it's just like, what makes it possible for the food bank to happen here? Yeah. What is it about this place that makes it the grass? And every activity, what is the place that creates the opportunity for us? I don't know. It just seems like such a... For all the words that to waste, it doesn't seem like something to waste words on. And because it comes up so often in the stories as well. And all.
What was it about this place that was worth keeping open?
Yeah.
What would be the impact of the loss of this place?
Yeah.
Those conversations gave you.
But then one of the things about asset and about this story is you can't work out of deficit. If you haven't got it, then you can't make it happen. So if they hadn't got the grass, they couldn't sit on it. Do you know what I mean? If they hadn't got the fish, and you have to do something else then. So it's the presenting problem, it's the resources you have available and what you're going to do with them.
Yeah, it's how I think about the 5 marks of mission. I think it was Warren who mentioned it first. He reads the bottom up. And the reason I'm studying sustainability is because if you don't look after the planet then that's got to come first.
Yeah, if you haven't got grass to sit on, you couldn't feed them. Yeah. So just a quick question that I need to throw back: is it worth me keep pursuing this and keep pushing it? Yeah. I don't know. I mean, if you so and if you have any blinding thoughts or anything that you just want to add, please really just tell me, because it is just out there kind of in a mix really. So thank you.
Good, thank you, Ellen. Thank you for such a hugely hugely informative and stimulating talk that has led to a real buzz of conversation. I think you've definitely given us some of that impact and flourishing we're going to be buzzing about.
Oh, good.
Help. So thank you very, very much. Do feel free to head off. Do feel free to have another cup of tea. We are